Hi everyone, welcome to the Movieception Show. I am Fariba, and today in this video we're going to talk about the Desi scenes in Miss Marvel episode 4. In this episode we saw that Kamala has now traveled to Pakistan to meet with her grandmother, and we basically get a lot of things going on. We get a lot of her heritage, we learn the organization called the Red Dagger, and yeah, we're going to try and break down a lot of the scenes from there. So let's get started. In this part of the video, we learned that Kamala is going to Pakistan for the first time, which I know I mentioned, like, it's a bit more of a rare sense to kind of hear that for anybody who does have parents from, another country. So, like, my parents in general with Bangladesh. But having thought about this a little bit, it does make a lot of sense for two reasons. One being that, of course, we know that Muniba kind of has a bit of this wariness about communicating with her own mother, just because of the whole situation regarding the bangle and the fact that there's a lot of people in the community who have talked a lot of the more not so great things about her mother, and it's just like because of this, what she feels like is kind of a disgrace to her, and just her image in a sense that, like, the last thing she wants to do is be in such huge contact with her mother, just because there is a bit of that shame that she does feel in terms of her community. Like, even we saw, I believe it was the second or third episode, I believe the second episode because that was the Eid episode, where all the aunties are talking crap about her mother, and not just, well, no, not just even her mother, like, I'm talking about Aisha, right? Like, they were saying this horrible things about how she was, a charmer, or that she was a witch or something like that, right? And because of all that shame, we can see why Munima doesn't really go to Pakistan that often, especially with her kids, to kind of, just to show them, like, hey, this is how, my home country is, this is what the people are, so on, so on, so forth. So that's one reason why, right? The second is, I think it just has to do with the fact that Kamala is the younger child. And the reason why I mentioned this is because this is something that I can actually share in terms of my own sister as well. Give an idea, right, in terms of my family, and in just comparing it to this. So in my family, we are two siblings. I am the oldest of the two siblings. So for me, considering that I have been, I am the older one, that I've actually had more opportunities to kind of, travel with my family and kind of explore the world, or whatnot. And in terms of just traveling to my parents' home country, the first time I actually visited my parents' home country of Bangladesh was when I was about 1 years old. That should tell you how young I was. Like, for me to have gone to Bangladesh as a 1 year old should say everything. It's basically like everything you have to say, right? Like, for us, when it comes to older kids, we're a bit more involved in our parents' lives, where we are traveling more with them, that people want to, meet us, whether it be, in the States or in our parents' home country. So that's why I was like, okay, well, that makes sense. And for me in general, I've been to Bangladesh about 3 or 4 times. I don't visit it as often as a lot of people would think. It's just because, like, I don't have that much of a huge connection to Bangladesh, just because I never really lived there. And even though my first time was when I was about 1 years old, I mean, what 1 year old remembers their trip to Bangladesh, right? I clearly don't. I remember more of my second and third trip to Bangladesh when I was, a bit older, like around, I think the second time was about like 10, and the third time I was about like 13. So that should tell you a bit of an idea of, like, what it's like for us who do travel to our home country, our parents' home country, and kind of, like, give you an idea that sometimes, even for the fact that our parents are born there, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have a huge connection over there, aside from the fact that we have a strong heritage about it. Now, having said that, I feel like, in terms of just Amir, I feel like he may have visited Pakistan more often because he is the elder child. Like, I'm the elder child, where, like, I have visited Bangladesh a couple of times. In the sense of the younger kids, I feel like it isn't as, like, opportunity isn't given as often as the older kids. And the reason why I say that is because my sister, she never really visited Bangladesh, so my home country, not until I believe, like, maybe when she was like 6 or 7 years old. Which, if you think about it, it's a pretty old age not to have visited Bangladesh for so long. But I think it's just more so because of the fact that now you have a second kid and now your family's growing, that you just don't have that time to really, invest, you know, going, traveling, going back to your home country, having your other kid meet up with your other your other siblings and your other younger child. It's of course makes a lot of sense that she hasn't really visited too many countries, especially my parents' home country, as often, because there isn't that much time to really invest in it. And considering that Kamala is a younger child, it makes a lot more sense why she hasn't visited Pakistan as of yet, not until like she's 16 years old, right? And a lot of it again might be it's because of a mix of, one, because Muniba doesn't want to really uh, talk to that side of the family too often, just because of like all that shame that's been going on, and how people have looked at her a different way because of it. But also at the same time, we also have the fact that Kamala is a younger child, and therefore it makes a lot more sense why the younger kid doesn't really get to visit their parents' home country that often. So I think I'm looking at it in terms of just like two different ways that, and not just two different ways, but just like two reasons why Kamala hasn't visited Pakistan for so long, not until she was 16 years old. And I gotta say that like it makes a lot more sense now, just like thinking about it in that perspective. So that's something that I wanted to mention in terms of Kamala's first visit. So just a couple of things just to mention. When you say salam alaikum, that's also just kind of like an Islamic greeting that you give. And when someone does tell you salam alaikum, they will respond saying wa alaikum salam. That's just kind of a way of responding back, saying, so assalamu alaikum means hi, and then wa alaikum salam would be like hi back in a way. So just kind of something I wanted to reiterate there. That's just something that Muslims will say in terms of like greeting each other. In terms of just the fact that she is meeting her cousins, I don't believe it's the first time. It sounds like they've met before. I'm gonna assume that either Kamala has actually met them like when she was a baby or something like that. So that'll be like the other reason why I think that maybe she doesn't really remember too much about Pakistan, or she's looking very nervous, or either that, or it's very possible that her cousins may have visited the States, which is a very, very common thing. I've had cousins from Bangladesh, visit from Bangladesh, and stay, just cruise around America, and just eventually at some point meet with their relatives. And in this case, I feel like that might be the case why she does know her relative, like her cousins in this case. In terms of just like the fact that they kind of put like a flowery necklace around them. I can't remember what it's called, but that's not a very common thing. I don't recall ever going to Bangladesh with that being put on. Maybe it's just something. It could also be just because they want to make it a really special, like a special arrival for Kamala, because this is her first time, or it sounds like it's her first time coming to Pakistan. But in terms of relatives coming and visiting us, yeah, that's a very common thing. I feel like that's just about any family who has dealt with this, whether they're visiting, especially if they're visiting like their own home country where they still have family there. In this case, like a very common thing to have. I know particularly for me, it's usually like my uncles or like my mom's like uncles who would come and visit us, pick us up from the airport, and then take us home. And yeah, and these airports are very crowded. So yeah, just a couple of things that are very common, whether or not it's just something that's Desi or just like a very general thing that anyone can really understand or relate to. So yeah. So as I was mentioning before, right? So when you think of Pakistan, a lot of people don't have a good knowledge of what Pakistan looks like, right? Like in terms of just hearing Pakistan, a lot of people think, oh, it's gonna be like a desert area where there's nothing and people are just like too conservative and all that sort of stuff. Surprisingly, it's not. Like, I think this is a very great depiction of what it is like in Pakistan, that it's just normal people living their normal lives. People are just biking, people are just walking, people are just eating. And not just that, but you can also see a lot of the landscape and just how there's a lot of beautiful structures and all that sort of stuff, right? And that just shows you like, oh, Pakistan is no different from like any other country where they have a lot of great architecture, buildings, and then there's people out there who's just like living their normal lives. And I love that we're finally seeing a bit more of a true accurate depiction of what it's like living in these countries, because a lot of people don't know what it is like to live in there. And I think I've heard from a couple of commentators that they really appreciate the fact that they're actually getting this perspective coming from the series, that like considering that some people had their own idea of what it was, only to see that it's like the complete opposite, where it's like it's just like anything else that anyone has experienced. That um, it does give a bit more of education that like not everything is what you think it is, right? So that's something that I really really loved about this episode, because it gave a bit more of a better perspective about it. That it's not just like some savage area that a lot of people would think. It's actually just a normal place where there's like a lot of it's just like, it has a great atmosphere. There's a lot of great things going on, and I know that later on in this episode we see even more of just like the streets of like Pakistan and what it's like seeing some of the bazaars and all that. So we'll talk about them more in that second. The other thing I want to mention is just Kamala's home, which is a bungalow, and it's a very common thing that you'll see throughout the South Asian subcontinent. Some of the houses are like this, especially ones that are a bit more on the richer side. For someone something like this big, you can tell they have a bit more of a luxurious life. The reason why I say that is because I know, in terms of my family, I know on my dad's side we have a lot more, like a more of an upper class family in that side. And I know recently my parents just visited Bangladesh, and right now they have a home that's really big, and it's just like enormous, right? And that just shows that okay, that might be an indication that you come from an upper class family. And that's just something I wanted to mention, because that bungalow is kind of similar to something that I have in Bangladesh as well, in terms of my dad's side at least. That it is a big house. It is considered more of a luxurious house just because it is big. It has a lot of space, and yeah, that's just something I wanted to mention. Like even I said in my reaction video that this is something that I personally have seen before as well. Because like when I visit Bangladesh, this is kind of like the size of my dad's house. Well, it's a bit complicated to kind of explain that now, because now there's like a whole thing with inheritance. Because my grandfather has passed away a long time ago. But having said that, you know that this is a big bungalow, which means that they do have a bit more of a luxurious lifestyle in terms of that sort of thing. So just wanted to mention that. I know I got a lot of flake about this in terms of just the fact that Kamala's nanny speaks a lot of English to her. So I do want to kind of clarify a lot of things. Yes, it is common for nannies like her. Like it's very clear that she comes from a really, very high background, more of a rich background, where they, may have gotten a bit more of an opportunity to receive a better education than most other people in Pakistan. That is definitely true. Like, I know in terms of my parents, right? They both come from basically middle to upper class families where they've had received better education, and therefore they have a better for them it's easier for them to converse in English, especially for my dad's case, because he actually did go have a visa. He had a student visa to study in the United States around in the late 80s, and learned, I don't know if he learned English there, if he learned English at home. I'm gonna assume it's kind of both. But nowadays when you speak to him, like his English is like, you wouldn't tell that he has an accent or anything like that, because his English is pretty, spot on it without really any accent. It'll be almost be like listening to me and like my accent and be like, oh, yeah, this is kind of how my dad speaks, right? Maybe like little to like no accent or anything like that. But in terms of just her nanny, right? Yeah, she knows how to speak English. My own grandma also can speak English as well. Maybe not as fluently as, Kamala's nanny, but she can speak English. She can understand it. And just in terms of that, yes, it is true that it is very likely that she did have a better opportunity in terms of education. Therefore, it's very easy for her to speak English, and that's why they converse more with Kamala about this. In terms of this scene, I think it is appropriate for the fact that she is speaking in English with Kamala, because, someone like me, right, I'm not very fluent when it comes to speaking Bengali, and sometimes I actually kind of have a lot of Banglish going on, and sometimes I have to break my Bengali a little bit just because I don't know what to say or how to kind of phrase some words, and therefore I'm struggling. So therefore, sometimes I do have to speak more English with my relatives, and that's just fine, right? Like I get that, and in this scene, like I can get if like Kamala's Urdu isn't the greatest or anything like that, and which makes a lot more sense why in this scene she's talking more in English with her grandmother than really speaking Urdu, which is again I'm not really. I think for me it wasn't more so a criticism for this scene. It was for a different scene, which I'll go more into. But yeah, here it definitely makes a lot more sense why her Nani's speaking in English and not in Urdu. So I just wanted to clarify that because I know I received a lot of messages about this, and I wanted to kind of clarify just kind of what I meant in terms of it. And yeah, it is true that she definitely does. She may come from a bit more of a higher upbringing in Pakistan, where she had more opportunities to learn the English language, and which makes a lot more sense because remember that India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, they were all under British rule for a long time. And even after the partition, a lot of what is left of the British stuff in those countries are still there, and particularly the education, right? There's a lot of schools where they still have British schools, or it's like under a lot of like British, not rule, but it's kind of hard to really explain. But from what my mom explained, because she actually attended a school that is, uh, not controlled, but it's more headed by more of like a British type of system where they do read a lot more of the British literature and all that sort of stuff, right? Like, I think the reason how I came to know about this is because I was reading Hamlet or something. Because I did IB, so reading Shakespeare is kind of like you're literally reading it like maybe once or twice per year. So I think I read like maybe about 8 Shakespeare plays slash stories in high school. And as I was reading those, my mom was like, "Oh, I read so and so book in school," and that's because her school was more under a British system, more so than it being more like a Bangladeshi head type of school. So that's why my mom actually knows English, because she did learn English in her home country because of the fact that she attended more of these British schools more so than really ones headed by the Bangladesh government, and or just whoever is controlling it, right? Like I don't know exactly how the system works, how the education system works in Bangladesh, but I just know that there were a lot of British schools in Bangladesh that like a lot of people can attend, which my mom did, and I'm pretty sure my dad may have as well. And that's how they learn a lot of things like English and even the literature itself. So that's why I wanted to kind of clarify that as well. That it's not just the fact that it's because her mom had like her grandmother had a better opportunity in terms of education, but because another thing you do have to take in consideration is that even after partition, a lot of the British education was still present in these countries, even after that. And my parents, they're born in the 60s, right? So that should tell you that even after so many years, even after the partition, that the British system was still there. And I think even when my cousin went to school, the British system was still a big education system was still a thing in in my parents' home country. So I just wanted to clarify that as well. That it's not just because of the class, but there's also the fact that even some of the leftovers of what happened with the partition and just like what happened with the Brits, there are still a lot of things that still remained in those countries even after the British, even after the UK had essentially forego that whole area and gave them their independence, right? So I just wanted to clarify that as well, is that there is still a lot of the British system, education system in these schools. So that makes a lot more sense now. I hope that makes a lot more sense, and also kind of just clarifying a lot of just like what I was mentioning about earlier. But my criticism is gonna be later on in this episode, so I'll mention that. Yeah, so this is a very common thing. Whenever you do visit your parents' home country, you're gonna be meeting a lot of these aunties, these relatives that you haven't really met in forever or just ever. In this case, with Ruxana, I think that's what her name was, Ruxana, which is a very common Muslim name, by the way. So yeah, here you can just see clearly with her mother, she's introducing her to Kamala. It's a very common thing that we have to deal with. Like, I think a lot of times whenever I go and visit my parents' home country, like every time they'd be like, "Oh, do you remember me?" And I'd be like, "No, I do not remember you." Of course, I don't really say that out loud, but I'm just kind of like thinking in my head, I'm like, "No, I don't really remember you," and a lot of it's just like it can be a bit overwhelming at times because you're just like you're just trying to enjoy the moment, of course. And I know that for Kamala, it's like, oh, another auntie, and like, um, it's just kind of like she just wants to like live the moment, whatnot. But it is a bit funny thing because this is a very common thing that you have to deal with, and I'm assuming that it's not just us. This is like anybody who deals with this. And this is like not even just a Desi thing, but like even a non-Desi thing. But yeah, I just want to mention this because this is a hilarious bit that I'm just like, okay, yeah, you're definitely being introduced to a whole bunch of people that you either haven't seen or ever seen before, and it just gets like it can get a bit overwhelming when you're just kind of just like you just want to kind of enjoy the moment. But yeah, that's something I wanted to mention. I mentioned that Kamala is not a typical Pakistani name, which is pretty hilarious because in terms of my name Fariba, it's not a Bengali name that you hear. It's actually more of a Persian name. So that's a bit of a hilarious thing that I can relate to with Kamala, that oh, we don't really have the typical Bengali or just kind of our own country's kind of common names. Well, one thing I'm going to mention is that she just ate a pani puri, which is like this really crunchy thing that you can, which again I remember in my reaction video I couldn't remember, now I remember now. It's a pani puri, which is basically like this crunchy thing that you eat. It's kind of like a circle-ish thing that like that's fried, but it also has like a hollow hole inside. And what happens with pani puri is that you can put like a whole bunch of fillings inside. Usually more like sauces than like actual like fillings, but you can put like I think like chickpea type of fillings inside, but then on top of it you put like actual sauces. There's usually like 3 or 4 sauces that you put in, but one of the things that makes pani puri so distinctive is that it is very, very spicy, right? And here we see that like Kamala could not handle the spice. I think we learned eventually that she isn't a person who can tolerate spicy food. Um, so that's something that really did surprise me because I'm somebody who loves eating spicy food, and that's just more so coming from my mom's side. But then my dad doesn't. My dad cannot tolerate spicy food at all. So you kind of have to like on how you're gonna try and how you try to order some foods in terms of like spiciness. But here, yeah, like we can tell that Kamala cannot tolerate the spiciness. Like it's super spicy. Pani puris in general are very spicy, but they're also very delicious. I think one of the funnier things that I've seen in terms of like pani puris that people actually make it sort of like a competition of like how many can you eat in one sitting. And a lot of times like, a lot of people will like go against another person, be like, okay, let's see how many pani puris can you eat in one sitting, and who will stop at first, because it is super super spicy, right? That's a common game that I've seen, at least like in what I've seen in Bollywood movies. I personally haven't done that because again, like it can get a bit intolerable, at least like just eating it. But again, it's super spicy. Again, like if you have the tolerance for the spiciness, that's great. If you don't, then maybe avoid it. But yeah, this is a pani puri. It's a very common street staple in like India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. I think pani puri. And but yeah, this is what pani puri is. It's this really crunchy thing. And what's so funny is that this is more of a luxurious party that's going on. As you saw earlier, that it's a big ginormous home where somebody's hosting or whatnot. And again, it just shows more of what Kamala's family is in terms of just like in terms of like their income, at least not income, but like kind of just their class. And in Muniba's side, that she does come from a really wealthy family. I think what's really funny though is that even with the pani puri that she's eating, it's something that you commonly see in the streets, because it is a street food, not like something that's like you'll eat like commonly in like an appetizer or whatnot. This is something that you'll find in the streets, like because like a big thing about these countries is that it's the street food, right? Where you have a lot of people have their stalls outside on the streets, and people will try to grab as much food as they can, and then they pay the stall or whatnot. That's a very common thing, at least in those countries. So like it's kind of like, I guess you would say equivalent of a food truck, but their stalls are not like a food truck, right? It's more like a stall where it's out, like where they're cooking outside. Essentially they're not cooking inside anything. It's more like they're cooking outside, they're making it like right next to like the stall, and then they have the food out for you in the street. So this is a very, very popular street food, aside from like dosa and everything like that. But yeah, pani puris you'll see more commonly in the streets. Honestly, eating it as a street food is actually better than like eating it from like like a wealthy place where they're just having a party. Like there's just something that makes a street foodiness, which I don't know if that makes sense, but there's a whole aspect of the street food of it that makes it very authentic. So that's something that I wanted to mention about pani puris right there. But yeah, if you want to try it out, try it out. But just be aware that it is hella spicy. So yeah.
Why is she so hot?
I don't know what she meant by like Florida. I really don't know because I'm from Florida. So I actually did not understand this reference at all. Maybe I'm just missing something. I have no idea. But the whole point of this is that they're trying to show a bit more of just the traditional things, more of the older things that, you know, make Pakistan. And I just don't get this joke about it being Florida. And I'm from Florida and I literally live here. So I have no idea about this reference. But again, maybe it's just, I don't know. I know Florida has its own reputation. Something that even I am aware of. So maybe it's just something that I don't know in general of like what people think of Florida. Maybe that's why. I don't know. I just don't get this Florida joke right here. So you're kind of seeing a bit of, I guess for a lot of people this is their first time seeing what it's like kind of roaming around Pakistan, where it's like, I think it's a bit of a cultural shock to a lot of people that this is what life is like in Pakistan, because this is what life is like in Pakistan, and the same can be said about India and Bangladesh as well. That you have these streets all around these countries where, you basically it's like the streets in each of these countries have this whole like area where you have all these bazaars, all these shops, all these food places where people are just like shopping from the outside, not really from the inside, because it's not everything is inside. Like everything is outside, kind of just like, you know, shown right in front of everyone, and people are just shopping from outside, kind of just like, okay, so we have this, we have that. It shows you kind of like more of the beauty of like what the streets are in terms of, you know, what's going on, these bazaars and everything. And yeah, and I'm glad that they're showing a lot of this because it gives you a better perspective of what these countries actually do look like. It's not, you know, desert places where there's nothing, or it's like dirty or whatnot. This is how our countries look like. I mean, this can be, and it's not just Pakistan, this can be applied for India and Bangladesh as well. I mean, yes, there are places where there are, you know, a lot of poverty, and that's something that I know they don't show here, but it is a common thing. But it's like, that's everywhere, right? And so it's really nice to see that we're seeing a bit more perspective, like what this is like, what life is like in Pakistan, kind of just like the streets of it. Like we can see all the salwar kamis, we can see all the saris that they're putting out to have, you know, to let people, you know, see like this is what we have. I think one of the things I also want to mention is that these are items that are a bit more authentic. And I know that's very ironic because a lot of people think that buying things from these countries will be like, you know, fake items, and it's not. These are real stuff that you're seeing, and that's why a lot of people go and shop at these streets, because, you know, there's just a thing about it that makes it so authentic, that makes it so nice and refreshing. And yeah, it's just a great atmosphere just walking down these streets, right? And I think even for Kamala, like, I think it's a bit of a shock for her as well, because she never really thought that, oh, this is, you know, this is no different from, like, you know, the bazaars that she walks through in, you know, New Jersey, right? And I also mentioned Jackson Heights as well. So yeah, this is just how life is. Like, I'm just glad that we're finally seeing a bit more of a better perspective about this, and this opens up to everyone's eyes that, like, just because of what you thought isn't necessarily what it is. So I really love this. Great transition, great way to kind of just show, like, hey, this is what the actual country looks like, aside instead of like what you actually thought it was. So I really love this. Okay, so she definitely knows how to speak. Oh, she at least understands Urdu. I can tell from that. One thing I want to mention, because it's a really, so one thing I want to mention that's really funny is that this guy has this like yeah, it's a fitwa. It's a fitwa, or some people call it kurta. So I say fitwa because that's just what it is. It's like a one-piece type of a dress that isn't necessarily salwar kameez. The salwar kameez has like an actual like whole like piece to it, where you have like the actual like top, the bottom, and as well as the dupatta. But in this case, it's a kurta, or a what was I saying before? Uh, um, yeah, whatever. I can't remember a lot of things right now. But one of the things I wanted to mention is that this guy says it's 500 rupees, and she's trying to bargain it for 300, which is really funny because it's a very common thing for Daisies to be bargaining in terms of like the clothes that they're trying to get. Like at least with my mom, anytime I'm with her, at least here, like it's not just here in the United States, but wherever she is in Bangladesh, right? They're always bargaining to have a lower price for what they're trying to buy, right? It's a common thing you'll see with these moms, these Desi moms, that they're gonna try and bargain everything as much as they can. And typically speaking, like they're able to kind of find the middle ground in terms of like a price of something, and they would buy it. And and I'm telling you, like it's whatever the price that this guy gives, it's gonna end up being lower in some way or some form by bargaining. Now of course, because Kamala is younger and she doesn't really have this experience and her mom isn't nearby her, of course she had to kind of pay 500 rupees instead of the 300 that she would have wanted to. And that's just because like at least for like us in terms of being like younger generation, we just don't have that, you know, skill of bargaining, of like, oh, we gotta be like, we're gonna like be set on that we want to only pay this, otherwise we're not paying it. I think it's just part of the way of like bargaining. Is just like kind of like, oh, if you don't want to go lower, then too bad, you lost my business type of thing. And that's why a lot of like, you know, businesses are willing to go down or at least compromise in terms of like the price and the like in the middle ground. But here, because she doesn't have really that experience and her mom isn't with her to kind of help her out, because I feel like in terms of moms, it just, they're so confident in how they try to present their prices, how they try to bargain, that like somehow they end up winning. Whereas because we are younger, that we just don't really have that experience, or we just don't have that sort of not sturdiness, but like we just don't have that sort of posture or just that determination that we're gonna get this price down. So I just want to mention that because I didn't even realize this in the first time I watched it, but now I'm like looking, I'm like, oh, this is a kind of a callback to just bargaining. But like here she failed, but had her mom been around, she probably would have been more successful getting it for like 300s. But then again, like she's also coming from, like her son is from a wealthy family, right? So it shouldn't make a bit of a it shouldn't make too much of an issue. But yeah, I thought that was a bit of a funny. Cousin just remarked on this word called ABCD, and this is distinctly for Desis who are not exactly from this country, right? Like basically anybody who lived in more of like the Western countries and not necessarily within their parents' home country. I believe this. I think this is more specific to Americans as well, because ABCD means American born something confused Desis. There you go. American born confused Desis. And that's how this is how a lot of people in those countries kind of think of Americans, who though have, you know, Desi born family, you know, parents who were born in those countries, but in terms of themselves, they were born in America. So very interesting that he actually said that. I've never heard any of my cousins ever call me ABCDs ever, or ever make a mention of this. So I'm really surprised that her cousin makes this comment. Kind of a bit rude. I don't know. Like again, like I'm a bit shocked that he mentioned the word ABCD, because like no one ever really says this unless we say it. But ABCD means American born confused Desis, because yes, we do get confused in these countries. Like we kind of walk around and like, at least if it's like your first time, you probably be like, whoa, like I've never imagined, you know, my home country being like this, right? Or that you don't really know how to navigate around your parents, you know, home country and whatnot. So that's probably why it's being remarked as American-born Desis. And yes, we are Desis because our parents are Desis, right? But we are a bit more confused, whatever, right? But again, I never expected him to actually say that word. But yeah, for those who wanted to know what that meant, so ABCD is American-born confused Desis. So yeah, again, I'm so surprised that he said that, but whatever. And explaining it to her too, like as if we're stupid. I don't know. Like I'm not even gonna go deep into this, because I've had dealt with cousins like this. Definitely not my primary cousins, thankfully, but more so my second cousins that I've dealt with. They kind of have this attitude about us Americans that I'm assuming that maybe that cousin isn't her favorite because he is a bit more of a, he kind of mocks her because of the fact that she is American, and that kind of annoys me as well because it's just because like just because we're born in America doesn't mean that we're stupid, that we don't know what's going on, or like we're just so one dimensional about everything in this world, or close minded. But again, that, I don't know what's up with that cousin. I feel like, again, but then again, I've dealt with that cousin before as well, where they're a bit more ignorant. So yeah, that's a bit of a confused. Like, I'm just kind of surprised that that's what's going on, but also in a sense, very relatable. So yeah, I'm kind of, I don't even know what to say about this. So I'm kind of in a bit of a shock right there. But yeah, we're seeing this guy who's taking a photo of Kamala. This guy's about to scam her, or rip her off basically. Because it's a very common thing you're gonna deal with in these countries, where you're gonna have people where they're gonna try and force you to do something because they're like a lower price or something, or they're gonna try and lure you into like buying something because it makes it look cool, right? And the first time, or when you look at it and be like, oh, I'd be cool with doing this, only to see that later on they'll be like, oh, by the way, this is how much this costs, you better pay up, right? This is a very common thing. It's something that you actually, this is something you have to be very careful as a tourist when you go into these countries, because you will be dealing with these people. And I know that's not just in Pakistani, it's not just Pakistan, India, or Bangladesh, right? This is something that you always see wherever you are in any country, right? Whether it be like in Italy, because I know I dealt with this in Italy, maybe in France, I think I dealt with this. Those are the only two places where I can recall, especially Italy. That was a big one. Italy, I felt this a lot, but there's going to be people out there who are going to be ripping you off because you are a tourist, or in this case, because you are an American. Like, they can tell if you're an American just by either how you wear, what you wear. So in this case, she's basically wearing her Avengers shirt. That kind of gives away the fact that, oh, she's American, therefore we can try and rip her off, right? Or if you try to speak and they realize that your speaking is really off, that's another way they can figure out, oh, you are a American or American tourist. There are a lot of things. Like, they're really smart people, right? So they can try and rip you off for a lot of things. So that's why, even as just us, we're like, in a sense, ABCD, right? Like, you have to be a bit careful with who you are, trying to do business with, or who you encounter, just because the last thing you want to do is be ripped off by these people. So again, a very common thing, something that even if you plan to visit, whether it be Pakistan, India, or Bangladesh, something that you really have to be careful with. And in general, if you're going to be touring any countries, you have to be really careful with what's going on. You got to be very attentive about who you're encountering, and making sure that you either don't get ripped off, or or like how we just kind of got ripped off because this guy kind of lured her in to get a photo, and she's like, I never really asked for this, because like she never really asked for this, but this guy really dragged her into it, and he's like, oh, you like it? Cool. Yeah, pay up. That's basically how it is. That's how the experience is. It's like, oh, you get lured into something, they're like, oh, do you like it? And you're kind of just like, I never asked for this, but they're kind of like, well, you could have been forced into it, and there's nothing you can do at this point, and now that you're kind of in the, situation, now you kind of have no other choice but to pay up. And because Kamala is, again, younger, she doesn't really have the experience of dealing with, how to counter these types of people, that, like, of course, like, all she can really do is just pay up without trying to, create any scene. Because the last thing you want to do is create a scene, right? And that's what a lot of people might do. Like, they'll try to create a scene, be like, oh, look, this thief, whatever, right? And then the last thing, like, Kamala needs is that type of attention, right? So, of course, because of her inexperience of how to, like, really deal with these types of people, that, like, all she can really do is just pay up and just move on, right? That's all she can really do. So something I want to mention right there. Okay, so I know in my reaction video I was mentioning how beautiful this place is, and it is so beautiful. Like, you can definitely see a lot of the more Pakistani type of design, the architecture, and not just like the Pakistani part of it, but more of like the Muslim part of it, because that's kind of what the architecture is. That's kind of like, not sorry, Muslim, I meant Islamic architecture, Islamic designs. This is kind of what they look like, and this one's so beautiful, right? Like, you kind of see the scenery of like this green in the background, but it's like a very soothing and just like beautiful type of green that's like in the background. I remember I was just kind of like fascinated about this, because I was just like, wow, this is so beautiful, right? Because it had a lot of this element of like this Islamic structure and all that. So I wanted to just mention that. Okay, so I was mentioning this in my reaction video, and so just to kind of give you a reminder, this actor right here is a Bollywood actor, a very very popular Bollywood actor. His name is Farhan Akhtar, and he's so well known in Bangladesh. Sorry, not Bangladesh. Sorry, in Bollywood, because not only is he an actor, but he's a director. He is a songwriter. He's a singer. He's literally like the multi talented actor that you rarely ever find in India. But yeah, so his name is Farhan Akhtar, and I mentioned before that he's actually done some movies with Shah Rukh Khan before. Remember, Kamala's favorite actor. Yeah, so he's actually done a movie with Shah Rukh Khan before, which is known as Dawn. In that movie, he was a director. He didn't actually feature in it. He didn't actually start doing acting until much, much later. But yeah, no, this guy, again, he is very well known in India. He's really well known as of this, and I think he's even won a couple of awards in different areas. I think in terms of singing, maybe, and definitely in acting, because he's actually won a Filmfare, which is the Filmfare Awards, kind of the Indian equivalent of the Oscars. So very talented actor. It's really nice seeing him, because I never even imagined that we're going to actually get a Bollywood actor showing up in this show, right? I mean, I think they tried to get Shah Rukh Khan, or there were like talks of trying to get Shah Rukh Khan, or I don't know. There was something with Shah Rukh Khan, but that never really worked out, or he never, you know, communicated with them or whatnot. But to see Farhan Akhtar in here, like, it's so nice, and it's so nice just to find a bit more like things that a lot of us Desis can, understand, be like, oh wow, it's so nice to see this Bollywood actor showing up in the show, and therefore it's like this makes it even more amazing just to see a bit more of like how Desi the show is. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that. Like, keeps calling Americans out for like whitewashing everything, but let's be honest, there's a lot of things that kind of been whitewashed, and I'm assuming that might apply for Chinese food as well. One of the things that I was really surprised about when I visited Bangladesh, and even India for that matter, because I went on a vacation trip to India, I think around the same time as my Bangladesh trip, and basically I was so surprised how amazing the Chinese food is in those countries, in my parents' home countries and in India as well. And I was just kind of like, why is the food so much more flavorful, more tasty, and even more authentic there than it is, in the United States? For one thing, like American Chopsy is like a big one, where it's like, even though the name is called American Chopsy, and you think that, oh, it's an American thing, it's something that it's not very commonly sold here, but it is sold in India and Bangladesh, right? Apparently, it's even my dad's favorite food. Um, and yeah, so just seeing this part where they're kind of like talking about food, and they're like, oh, she's like questioning why the soup is so red. It's because it's supposed to be red, because that's just how the food is supposed to be. That's the authenticity of it. So that's something I wanted to mention, because that is something that you'll see a bit of a huge difference between whether you're living in the United States or you're going and visiting a Desi country, because you're like, oh, whoa, the food is so different compared to like what we thought of the food here in the United States, whatnot, right? So wanted to mention that very big thing to talk about in this scene. So a lot to dive into this scene. So for one part, she talks about how Muniba is basically cleaning up the house. Very typical for any daughter to be doing, especially if they're visiting their mother for like after a long time, right? My mom has done the same thing, where she would go and visit her mom's or her dad's place, or her late dad's place. My grandfather had passed, but back then when he was still alive, my mom would always go about and start cleaning up the house and be like, okay, let's start cleaning up the house. Let's start taking care of you. Like, she goes full mother mode on them. It's really hilarious. So it's great to see kind of how this is the same situation with Muniba. Great thing to kind of mention. But I think the most important part is just talking about more of the partition, right? The aftermath of what happened, right? The ramifications of it. So she talks about how basically we had these Englishmen just kind of like flee the country and letting us deal with the whole, mess of it. And that is, again, I've mentioned this before, that the partition was not an easy thing. There was a lot of hardship with it. People are just trying to move around, trying to figure out where they want to relocate. And not just that, but like just the whole transportation of it was a mess. There was some violence to it. I think I was mentioning before, like, it was a very violent time as well, because at least from what I've seen in some of the more Bollywood movies, that like there was a lot of riots, there's a lot of fights going on between those who are trying to relocate in between Pakistan and India. It was a very 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 dangerous time with the whole situation um, with the whole situation regarding the partition, right? And I think the bigger thing that really is mentioned here is the fact that even though her passport says Pakistan, in her heart she claims to be Indian, and this is a very common thing to be hearing from anybody who has lived through this moment, right? Because you've lived in this country for so long, only to see that because of this whole, breakdown of this country, this rebordering, that now you kind of have to relocate because, well, you might be more safer in one area than another area. And a lot of it kind of does have to go back to kind of this religion situation, because people who were relocating to Pakistan are most likely Muslims, and those who are relocating from Pakistan into India were more likely Hindus. And this is a big, big thing that needs to be mentioned, because there's been this whole religious, I don't know if you can say religious, but there has been this whole war in a sense, right, in between Muslims and Hindus in India. It's a big thing that you kind of hear in the news. Like this kind of goes back to some of the later things like the Bombay riots and all that. That you kind of hear all these things that, like, oh, they have Muslims and Hindus kind of just clashing with each other just because, they happen to be Muslims or Hindus, right? And this is something that's a really big problem that's been occurring for a long time. And not just that, but then we also have this whole conflict with the Kashmir area, where Pakistan and India are trying to, like, figure out who's going to claim what land, who's going to claim the whole land. There's so much that happened because of the fact that partition occurred, that there's been a bit more of the consequences of it than really just like trying to resolve anything, right? And that's what she mentioned, like, oh, these English people just left and fled the country and letting us deal with all the aftermath, the ramification of it. And again, it hasn't been easy. Even today, we're still kind of dealing with just sort of the consequences of what happened after partition, right? Like, even to this day in India, like, you'll hear this all the time. And so, again, it is a bit heartbreaking just for her to hear this, be like, I just, want to, live. I just want to appreciate who I am in terms of, like, where my heart is, and the fact that we have this whole situation that happened in the partition, that I can't really embrace who I am because of the fact that these are the consequences of it, right? So it is a bit heartbreaking to be hearing that from Sana, be like, oh, my heart is with India, but my passport says Pakistan, right? Very, like, I can't say for myself if I've had family members who felt this, because, again, my family is from Bangladesh. I don't think there was that much of a huge thing going on in terms of, like, the whole relocation thing, because, again, technically speaking, they were East Pakistan at that time, as I mentioned in some of my earlier videos, that Bangladesh wasn't Bangladesh until much later. But having said that, like, this is a thing. This is part of history that has happened. You can't unchange it, and this is the consequence of it, that she's trying to let Kamala know that this is my history right here that you need to know. So, very important part of the story, and I hope that a lot of people now understand more of what happened in the partition, because it is not spoken of. No one really talks about what happened with the Indian-Pakistan partition. Like, not that many people know about it, unless, of course, if you're like a Desi like me, who's always heard about it, who's always seen it in Bollywood movies, who's always, tried to talk to my grandparents about it and be like, hey, what happened during this time, right? Or at least especially in case of, like, my, Bangladesh independence, that's something I have to ask my parents about. So yeah, it's really nice that we're being a bit more educational about this, like, getting this idea of, like, what really happened around that time, and it's kind of giving more of an education of what's going on. I do hope that a lot of people are going to start, researching more about this, just to understand what's going on. Like, I know kind of the basis of it, most people will know, is like, there's Mahatma Gandhi, there's Muhammad Jinnah Ali, and all that sort of stuff, the non-violence thing and all that, right? So, but yeah, that's just something that's really, really powerful in this conversation that Sana has with Kamala. So I'm glad that they kind of showed this campfire scene that they have, because, again, it just shows once again that people in Pakistan are just like any other people around the world, where they're just kind of chilling, they're kind of doing their own thing, where they're singing along, they're kind of hanging out. Something I really love about that, because it kind of shows that, oh, Pakistani people are just like anybody else, right? Really love that part. One thing I also want to mention is that they're eating biryani. So this is, it's really cool that they're, I mean, not cool, but, like, it's really interesting that they're eating it from, like, a plastic bag, which I think makes sense, because that's probably what they had. But biryani, I was mentioning this in my reaction video that biryani is like a very common staple food in Pakistan, India, Bangladesh. Like my mom makes biryani all the time. Like she makes it at least once or twice a month because it is such a commonly made food in these countries that like everyone will eat it, right? Now, in terms of just biryani itself, there's different iterations of it. Like, it can vary between regions. So, like, my mom, the way that she makes it is a bit more like, I guess you can say more of like the Bengali way. There's also like kachi biryani, there's like the hedi biryani. There's so many ways to be making biryani that it's not just a one single thing that it is of itself. There's so many variations of it depending on where people are from, what district it is, what the culture is. So just kind of wanted to explain more about that in terms of like just biryani is just not a single thing that everybody makes in a similar way, right? It is done differently depending on in terms of just the district, and it can vary upon just about that, right? Again, it depends on what ingredients you use. As I mentioned before, there's tahiti, there's as I mentioned before, there was tahiti, there was gachi. I think the one my mom makes a bit more just like the traditional way of like making it. But yeah, I just want to mention that you can eat any different sort of biryani and they're not really the same because it depends on just like how people make them from how they grew up with it. And it varies on districts, especially in like India where it's like a big country with so many districts. You're gonna see a huge variation of how biryani is made. So, but having said that, biryani is a very, very, very staple food that is eaten throughout the South Asian subcontinent. And again, like for someone like me who's literally has a mom who's well known for her biryani, yeah, it's like a big thing. Like eating biryani is like a very, very big. Mom is enjoying eating this biryani, and there's just a thing about whenever you go to your home country, there's a bit of this authenticity when you're eating the food because it's just a commonly made food in those countries that like whenever you eat it, it's just so delicious, so flavorful, but it's also very homely and very authentic, right? And you can just tell from the way that Kamala reacted that she was really enjoying the biryani, even though she was asking if it was spicy, which again, like, but again, it makes sense because not everyone can tolerate spicy. Most people in those areas love eating spicy. I love eating spicy. My mom loves eating spicy. Not everyone can actually tolerate it. Like my dad, like he can't really eat spicy. My sister, although before she could not tolerate spicy before, she's a bit more used to it now. But yeah, I love this reaction that Kamala has because it just shows again that like whenever you come to your home country that the cuisine is just something different, right? Like the way that things are made just seems really authentic and it's just so delicious that like in a sense it makes you not want to leave. Like I've had that feeling before. Like sometimes just having experienced everything that like you don't want to leave. So I wanted to mention that one quick bit as well. I just can't really figure out the name of it. It's a very common song you'll hear. You can even tell by the from the tune of it. It's a bit more of an older song, probably from like an older Bollywood movie. So, but it makes sense because like Sana is a bit, she's a grandmother. This is something that she grew up listening to, right? So so the songs like this one are a bit more, soothing, a bit more slow, but also like very meaningful. I don't know the name of the song exactly, but it's a very common song you'll hear. I think you actually hear this song a lot in weddings or like more so like in the bridal showers, mehndi ceremony type of thing. But again, it doesn't really matter how you listen to it, right? Or where you listen to it. It's just a matter of if you enjoy it, right? So, yeah. Where we actually have this interaction between Muniba and Sana, where of course like the fact that she's massaging her legs is a very common thing that I've also seen with my mom do with her mom. Just again, it just shows a bit more of the affection of everything. But the bigger part is that she's asking her mother to come and live with her in America, which is a very common thing that a lot of us, or at least a lot of our parents, try to convince our grandparents that like, hey, you don't really have anyone else here. It's not great that you're kind of living this mess, right? Like in her case, it was like a dump, right? Why not just come and live with us where you can, be closer to us, be closer to your granddaughters or your grandchildren, and therefore, it'll be a much better life for you just knowing that you are with your family. And this is something that Muniba is trying to do with Sana, be like, hey, come to America. I think it'll be better for you in that sense, right? This is a very common thing that a lot of Desis have to deal with, and I bet that this is not just a Desi thing, but for anybody who is non-Desi, have to kind of like, you know, be like, hey, I love you, please come with me to America, right? Now I know that I was criticizing this scene a little bit because it wasn't as authentic as I wanted to be, because it should have been more of a conversation in terms of more of the Urdu than really just speaking more in English. Again, like I think a lot of people mention that because Sana and Muniba, they come from more of like a wealthy background, that they have this, you know, ability to talk more in English. They're a bit more fluent in it, which is great. Like I understand that, right? But even my mom and my dad, they come from, I wouldn't say wealthy families, but they come from a very well, you know, they come from really well known families. My mom has gotten a great education, and even with that being said, like that doesn't mean that she should only speak in English, right? Like for her, she converses with her mom in Bengali because that's the way she wants to, you know, talk to her. And so that's why I kind of felt like, oh, okay, I didn't feel like this scene was authentic, because at least what I've seen in terms of my mom and her mom, right? Like she's spoken with Bengali with her all the time, and yeah, there can be this class thing where like a lot of people who have a bit more of the money to, you know, get this education, they'll be more fluent in English than people who don't have, you know, who are a bit more poor. But even my parents are kind of like the same thing with like their family, right? Like they've had like these really luxurious houses. They've been, you know, living in a well, you know, they've been, you know, they've never ever had to struggle, right? That's just the thing, right? They've had the education, they have the food, they had the housing, they've had a roof over their heads, right? But even then, like, so that again, so like they're not, so her, like, so this family is not that different from my parents. Yet my family, or at least my mom and my dad, they always spoke in Bengali with their families, their relatives, and all that sort of stuff. Because they always feel like it makes them feel homely, right? That speaking in their home country, their home country, their home, you know, mother tongue, it just feels a bit more, you know, it just feels a bit more homely, that they can actually speak in this language that, you know, they grew up in. So that's why I was like criticizing the scene, because I was like, oh, it's not authentic because she wasn't really speaking in so much Urdu. And I get it, like a lot of people don't want to read subtitles, but this is like what, a 2-3 minute scene right here where Sana is talking to her mother, and like the Urdu shouldn't have been that big of a deal, right, to speak authentically. And that's why I was saying that, like, in this scene, I just felt like maybe perhaps they should have made this really, you know, not just made it just a really great moment between Sana and Muniba, but also should have added this authenticity where they're speaking Urdu to just to show that, like, this is, you know, this is their life, this is part of their culture, and that's why for her it's like it's really important for her to speak in Urdu to her mom, that because this is just part of how she grew up, right? And that's why I was trying to make that, you know, I was trying to give this, you know, trying to explain that, because like at least with my mom, like it feels nice for her to be speaking Bengali in her home country, especially if it's like her relatives or whatnot, right? It just makes her feel like she's at home now. That's why I was like, okay. But I do agree though that because Muniba is still dealing with the fact that like there's a shame that's fallen upon her family because of like what people are talking about, with the fact that, oh, Aisha kind of just like, you know, goes missing and whatnot. She has this like really mysterious vibe to her, that maybe that's why she doesn't really talk in Urdu as much, and maybe that's why. And if that's the case, that makes a lot of sense why. I was just giving more my opinion of like the more authenticity of it, but even with that said, like it makes a lot of sense why she doesn't really speak in a lot of Urdu, like aside from like a few phrases here and there. So, but yeah, that was just what I'm trying. That's why I wanted to clarify. I wasn't trying to backbite about the whole like, oh, how dare she not speak in Urdu? Like, and that's not something that I was trying to. That's not the way I was trying to come across. I was just trying to say that it would have been nice to kind of have this more authentic feeling, that with this scene, that like, oh, because this is a mother-daughter moment, that it would have been nice to kind of see a bit more what I would have seen more at home, what I would be at home and at my parents' home country, and be like, oh, so this is how they would speak, and therefore I thought maybe this would be the same thing. But yeah, that's why I'm trying to clarify that. Nothing to like really say that this is a horrible scene or anything like that. It's just like, you know, scene between Muniba and Sana, because they kind of have to fix this sort of estranged relationship they once had. Because again, remember, Muniba never really wanted to talk about Aisha, let alone like Sana, right? So yeah, that's why again this is a very important scene in general. It's a lot. Like one of the things I really loved about these last 10 minutes of this episode is that the action sequences didn't feel like just any sort of action sequence. It felt so much like a Bollywood masala film, because a lot of these masala films are basically just action, whole. Um, and one of the things about Bollywood is that you have a lot of these films that are action, right? A lot are like filled with action, right? And there's just something about just masala films that are just really exciting, that just makes it really fun. And that's something that I really loved about these last few minutes, because it definitely felt very Bollywood masala type of action. That's something that I was just like, wow, this kind of, I had this whole like feeling about it, and I really loved a lot of these scenes, these action scenes. It wasn't just like any sort of action, but just this whole, masala type. That's why I wanted to kind of stop here, just be like, oh, this is kind of what most masala films feel like in terms of just like the action and all that, because it's just so, like a lot going on. It's a lot of fun. You can hear a lot of these background songs that's just like setting up the scene and be like, oh, this is gonna be a fun scene that's gonna be happening and whatnot, and these characters are gonna be fighting and everything. There's gonna be probably explosions from what I can tell you. Like there's gonna be some sort of explosion. There's probably gonna be cars like being you know destroyed or whatnot. But again, this is what masala films are like, especially in terms of like the action. It definitely felt like it, so I really loved that scene. I don't know, I know in America we have our wheels on the left side, but in most other places the wheels and everything are on the right side, so it is a bit of a weird thing, especially if like you've never drived on the right side of the car. But yeah, that's just something I want to mention, because it's a very common thing, especially in India, Bangladesh, Pakistan. Something you also see in the UK as well. And I think even like a lot of European countries. Although I know when I went to Italy, and I know when I had visited Italy and Spain, that they had cars that were on the left side, so ones that we're more used to. But most cars, at least in those countries, you'll see are on the left side. Like the handles on the left side. The handles on the right side. Whereas most of the cars that we see here in the United States are on the left side. So, a very interesting bit. I love how she's saying Bismillah, Bismillah, because that's literally the only way to kind of hope that things are going to go well, right? So, I love that part. Yeah, one thing I wanted to mention about masala films is that there's a lot of destruction in terms of like property all around the streets. So that's why, again, there's a whole masala feel to it, because of, like a lot of things get destroyed in terms of like things that are happening and around. So another mention right there. So yeah, if you can't already tell what this scene is, this is basically a depiction of the 1947 partition, where a lot of people are going on these trains and basically trying to relocate in between India and Pakistan. In this case, I think this train is going to be going from India to Pakistan, right? I'm not really sure. We're going to see more of this probably in the next episode. But it's really interesting that they've transitioned from like the present day to more of 1947, to kind of give a bit more of like, okay, we're going to go back in time to really start learning about Kamala's heritage, her roots, everything, right? Her background, who is Aisha, Sana, what happened to Sana around that time, right? So this is something I'm really excited to see in the next episode, because it seems as if the next episode is going to be very focused on 1947 and the partition that happened, and how she's going to be living through this situation. And again, it's really interesting how she was able to time travel back around that time, because again, like, we know that we've seen the Avengers sort of already undergone their whole time travel in Endgame, right? From 2023 up until like different moments and around where they could find the Infinity Stone. And here we have like Kamala using her own bangle to travel back into 1947. I don't know how they're going to explain that, because I'm not sure if that was something that is a big part of her powers in the comics. But having said that, I'm really excited to see how they're going to try and depict the whole situation with the partition, because it is a very important part of history, not just for Kamala's history, but just in general of like the whole, just India and Pakistan in general, and just how they had to deal with this, and even in Bangladesh in that sense as well. So yeah, I'm really excited to see how they're going to depict this. I think I even mentioned before there used to be violence with all that was happening with partition, but I don't think they're going to be doing that in this at least in these sequences. But we'll see what happens. But yeah, again, it's really nice that we're kind of going back to the partition area to kind of see this viewpoint of what happened, which I hope is going to give a lot of non-Desi people who are not familiar with the partition a better idea of what it was like around that time. Because again, it was a mess. It was a huge mess, and now hopefully people will actually have a better idea of it. Again, it is fictional, so I mean, at least in the show, it is a fictional show, so it might not be as accurate in depicting it, but it'll give a bit more of a better idea of what it is. So I'm so excited to see this next episode right here. So yeah. So yeah, that's all I really have to say about Miss Marvel episode 4. These are some of the Daisy scenes that I was able to catch and kind of give an explanation for. I know there's a lot of mention about the partition, and now we're actually going to be going into an episode where they're going to talk more, not just talk about it, but they're actually going to show more of what happened around this partition, right? So I'm really excited to see how they're going to try and depict this. I'm going to assume more it's going to be involving just what happened to Sana and Aisha, and what happened to Aisha in general, because we don't really know what happened to her. So I'm really interested to see what happens in this next episode in terms of just trying to answer all these like ambiguous questions about Kamala's roots and heritage and just her family in general. But yeah, I'm really excited to see more of it, because again, we're already in Pakistan. We're seeing a lot more of Kamala's heritage really being shown on the screen. It's been playing a big part of just her, you know, character arc in general, which I really appreciate, because I know that her family has played a big part of her origin story. Because again, they've changed the whole Inhuman storyline, and somehow they had to find a way to kind of fix that if we're not going to involve the human storyline. And in this case, involving her family history as like the basis of it is like a really creative, bright idea of just trying to showcase Kamala Khan's story. So having said that, I'm really excited to see what happens in episode 5, how they really try to, you know, break down the whole partition. But yeah, that's all I really have to say in terms of just what I've seen so far in episode 4. So yeah, hopefully we'll see a lot more in episode 5. But what do you think? Did some of the things really educate you in terms of like more about the partition, more of like what it's like, what the actual scenery is like in Pakistan compared to what you had originally thought? Did you learn a lot more about the cuisine? Because I know I talked about a lot about food, because I love food, and again, I hope that gave you a bit more of an idea of what the food is like in Pakistan, kind of just more of like the family dynamic as well. Let me know in the comments below, and yeah, and like, comment, subscribe. So yeah, that's all I have to say.